So how do we actually engage in historical inquiry? One method of inquiry is the SCIM strategy. The SCIM strategy for analyzing historical primary sources involves four phases: summarizing, contextualizing, inferring, and monitoring. In addition, each of these four phases consists of four analyzing questions. Processing through these four phases and responding to each of the four analyzing questions per phase will help you develop the ability to analyze historical sources more thoroughly. Let's take a closer look at each of the four phases. Summarizing is the first phase of the SCIM strategy. When summarizing, you examine a source, such as this letter from President Kennedy to the Vice President during the space race, to locate any information or evidence that is explicitly available. That is, information or evidence such as the subject or purpose of the source, the author or audience of the source, or the key facts, ideas, or perspectives within the source. Sometimes the evidence in the source is straightforward and obvious, and other times it is not. Ultimately, the process of summarization should focus on developing historical evidence relative to your guiding historical questions. While engaging in the SCIM strategy phase of summarizing, you should work to answer the four analyzing questions associated with the summarizing phase. Specifically, what type of historical document is the source? What specific information, details, and/or perspectives does the source provide? What is the subject and/or purpose of the source? And who was the author and/or audience of the source? Following the summarizing phase, the next phase of the SCIM strategy is the contextualizing phase. One of the main challenges of contextualizing is making sense of the source within the context or time period in which the source was produced. Sources are always remains of the past, and thus produced during a specific time period, for a specific purpose, and by a specific individual or group. Thus it is important to recognize that words, images, meanings, values, and customs of the period under study may be very different than those of today. For example, this letter was written in 1961, a time that was near the beginning of the space race, but well into the Cold War, a time when the relationship between the United States and the Soviet Union was strained. While engaging in the SCIM strategy phase of contextualizing, you should work to answer the four analyzing questions associated with the contextualizing phase. Specifically, when and where was the source produced? Why was the source produced? What was happening within the immediate and broader context at the time the source was produced? And what summarizing information can place the source in time and space? Following the summarizing and contextualizing phases, the next phase is the inferring phase. In answering historical questions and working with primary sources, sometimes the evidence is not explicitly stated or obvious in the source. In these cases, the evidence may be hinted at within the source and need to be drawn out. This process of drawing out or creating interpretations based on information within the source is called inferring. As part of inferring, we revisit initial facts gleaned from the two earlier phases and begin to create interpretations. While engaging in the SCIM strategy phase of inferring, you should work to answer the four analyzing questions associated with the inferring phase. Specifically, what is suggested by the source? What interpretations may be drawn from the source? What perspectives are indicated in the source? And what inferences may be drawn from absences or omissions in the source? At this point in the analysis, you have garnished a fair amount of information through summarizing and contextualizing the source, as well as inferring from the source. In the next phase, the monitoring phase, You are to reflect on your initial assumptions and interpretations, and current understandings of the source, in relation to the source's evidence and context, and your guiding historical questions. This reflective monitoring is essential in making sure that you have asked the key questions from each of the previous phases. By reflecting on your analysis, you are double-checking and demonstrating your own awareness of the careful and thoughtful processes necessary to analyze historical sources. While engaging in the SCIM strategy phase of monitoring, you should work to answer the 4 analyzing questions associated with the monitoring phase. Specifically, what additional evidence beyond the source is necessary? What ideas, images, or terms need further defining from the source? How useful or significant is the source for its intended purpose in answering the historical questions? And what questions from the previous phases need to be revisited in order to analyze the source satisfactorily? Using the SCIM strategy as part of the process of historical inquiry will allow you to analyze historical primary sources more deeply, thoroughly, and carefully. Moving through the 4 phases of the SCIM strategy is a recursive and thoughtful approach to historical inquiry that requires a concerted level of engagement with each source in order to develop and write an historical interpretation. The historical interpretation should entail a synthesis of the evidence extracted from the source during the 4 phases of the SCIM strategy, and not a simple listing of the evidence. Ultimately, the historical interpretation will allow you to begin to investigate and respond to the guiding historical question.